Iran's national electricity company CEO Mohammed Al-Haddad stepped in front of cameras and confirmed the numbers that explain everything happening inside Iran right now. 4,200 megawatts of generation capacity dropped from the national grid. Damage to more than 2,000 points across Iran's electricity system. Power plants, substations, transformers, and transmission lines scattered across the country. BBC Persian, reporting on July 18, 2026, put it this way: American strikes have damaged more than 2,000 individual components of a grid that was already running a 13,600 megawatt deficit before the first bomb fell. Scheduled 2-hour blackouts are stretching to 4 and 6 hours. Factories are going dark for up to 12 hours at a time. Iran's energy minister Abbas Ali-Abadi told reporters on July the 20th that the country is in, and these are his words, an exceptional situation. Al Jazeera reporters touring Tehran found a city in a state of managed collapse. Large digital billboards sitting dark, police officers standing at major intersections, manually directing traffic because the traffic lights have failed. Small business owners running noisy portable generators on city sidewalks to keep perishable food from spoiling during sudden outages that arrive without warning and last longer than any official schedule admits. In a country where water moves by electric pump, where hospitals run dialysis machines and ventilators on grid power, where desalination plants supply drinking water to millions of people living in one of the most arid regions on Earth, a power grid with 4,200 megawatts knocked offline in summer heat, reaching 41 degrees Celsius, is not an inconvenience. It is a humanitarian emergency unfolding in real time. And this video is going to give you the most complete and most analytically honest picture of what is actually happening to Iran's civilian population as a result of what has been done to its power grid, how it happened, what the cascade consequences are, and where this goes. We are going to start with the numbers that the Iranian government's own officials have confirmed, because this is not a story built on speculation or secondhand accounts. This is a crisis whose dimensions have been acknowledged by the people responsible for managing it. We are going to explain the specific infrastructure that has been struck, and why the combination of gas field attacks, power plant strikes, industrial facility bombing, and desalination plant destruction creates a cascading interdependency failure that is qualitatively different from any single infrastructure strike, and more severe than the sum of the individual damage points suggests. We are going to talk about the 10,000 people in 20 villages who lost their water supply when a desalination plant in the Banji village on the Iranian coast was struck, because that specific confirmed number is the most direct and most concrete illustration of what electricity grid damage means for access to drinking water in a country where water moves by electric pump. We are going to walk through the Mobarake and Mashar industrial facility strikes and explain why the energy analyst who told Al Jazeera that a source of surplus has become a source of deficit is describing a compounding damage dynamic that multiplies the effective impact of the strikes beyond what the raw megawatt numbers suggest. We are going to go through what life looks like inside Tehran and the provincial cities right now based on Al Jazeera's ground-level reporting. The generators on sidewalks, the dark digital billboards, the police manually directing traffic at intersections where the signals have failed, the queues for ice and fuel. We are going to cover the medical dimension with the specificity it deserves, because dialysis machines and ventilators in hospital operating rooms that run on grid power do not slow down when the grid fails and the generator runs out of diesel. They stop. We are going to cover Trump's 48-hour deadline that threatened to strike Iran's power plants unless Tehran fully reopened the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran's counter-threat to strike Gulf energy infrastructure in response. And we are going to do the honest dual causation accounting of how much of this crisis is the direct result of American strikes versus how much of it was a pre-existing structural failure, 13,600 megawatts deep, that the conflict accelerated and amplified rather than created from a position of grid health. And then, in the strategic analysis section, we are going to draw the board on infrastructure warfare as a coercive military instrument, the Ukraine precedent, and what it means for international legal consistency, and what the Iranian regime's decision to absorb this level of civilian infrastructure damage rather than negotiate reveals about its actual political calculus, and what that calculus means for how this conflict ends. Stay through all of it. If we rewind to understand the state of Iran's power grid before a single American bomb fell on it, what emerges is a picture of a system that was already in serious and documented trouble. The grid deficit before the conflict began, the gap between what Iran's electricity system could generate and what its population demanded during peak summer usage, was estimated by researchers advising the Iranian parliament at up to 13,600 megawatts. Think about that number against the total confirmed war damage of 4,200 megawatts. Iran's grid was already 13,600 megawatts, short of meeting summer demand before the conflict. The strikes added 4,200 megawatts of damage on top of a system that was already severely stressed. Electricity supply before the conflict barely reached 68,420 megawatts, while demand climbed past 81,000 megawatts. The structural reasons for that pre-existing deficit are multiple and interconnected. Outdated power plants that struggle to maintain output in extreme heat because maintenance has been neglected for years. Fuel supply disruptions caused by sanctions that limited Iran's ability to import the gas turbine components needed to keep aging plants running efficiently. Drought conditions that have reduced the hydroelectric generation capacity that was supposed to provide a seasonal buffer. Rampant cryptocurrency mining operations, consuming enormous quantities of power from a grid that could not afford to spare it. And decades of pricing policy that subsidized electricity at rates so low that conservation incentives effectively did not exist. Iran's energy expert Arman, quoted by Al Jazeera, described the situation with a phrase that cuts through all the political complexity. The war was merely the straw that broke the camel's back. The root of the crisis is chronic underinvestment. The strikes broke a grid that was already breaking. And understanding that dual causation is essential to understanding both the humanitarian reality and the strategic reality of what is happening right now. Now let us go through exactly what was struck and why the specific combination of targets created a cascading failure that is worse than the sum of the individual damage points. The South Pars gas field strike in March 2026 was the single most consequential infrastructure attack on Iran's power grid, even though it received less coverage than the military facility strikes that followed. South Pars is the world's largest natural gas field and Iran's primary domestic gas supply. Gas fuels more than 80% of Iran's electricity generation. Strikes on gas production infrastructure at South Pars knocked out an estimated 20 to 25% of Iran's total gas production capacity. When you reduce gas supply by 20 to 25% to a grid that uses gas to generate more than 80% of its electricity, the arithmetic is brutal. You are cutting off the primary fuel for the majority of your generation capacity at the exact moment that summer heat is driving demand to annual peak levels. The power plants that were supposed to compensate for the gas supply reduction were themselves targeted in subsequent strikes. The Kish Island power plant was struck directly. Distribution network infrastructure in Bandar Abbas, Jask, and Chabahar, the cities running along Iran's southern coastline that are closest to the Strait of Hormuz, was severely damaged, creating localized blackout conditions in the areas where the conflict's primary maritime activity is concentrated. And then there are the industrial strikes that created a damage multiplier that Iranian energy analysts have been describing with visible alarm. Mobarake Steel in Isfahan and Khuzestan Steel, which together consumed approximately 2,000 megawatts of electricity from the national grid every day, were struck by joint U.S.-Israeli operations. The immediate effect of taking those two facilities offline was to remove 2,000 megawatts of demand from the grid, which sounds like it should help the shortage, but simultaneously, the Mashahar petrochemical complex, which was not just a consumer of grid power, but an actual surplus generator that fed electricity back into the national grid, was also bombed. Mashar was previously one of the facilities that helped compensate for the grid's structural deficit by generating surplus power. After the strike, it stopped generating and began drawing from the grid to meet its own residual operational needs. The energy analyst quoted by Al Jazeera put it with precise clarity. A source of surplus has become a source of deficit. That reversal, a facility that was adding supply to the grid, now adding demand instead, is the kind of compounding effect that turns a manageable shortage into an unmanageable crisis. And then there is the desalination plant at Banji village on the Iranian coast, because that specific strike is the single most direct evidence of the water-electricity interdependency that makes power grid damage a direct threat to drinking water access for Iran's civilian population. 10,000 people in 20 villages lost their water supply when that facility was struck, according to the water company's chief executive quoted by the semi-official Tasnim news agency. 10,000 people, 20 villages, one desalination plant. And that is one confirmed incident. Iran has multiple desalination plants along its coastline, particularly in the southern provinces that border the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Regions where the geography and climate mean that desalinated seawater is not a backup water source, but the primary drinking water supply for the population. When grid power is disrupted, the electric pumps that move water from desalination plants to storage systems and from storage systems to homes and businesses stop. The water stops moving even if the pipes are intact. Iran's water system is not gravity-fed in most urban and peri-urban areas. It is pump-fed, and pumps require electricity. This is the chain that makes power grid damage inseparable from water access damage in the specific geography and infrastructure context of Iran. An electricity crisis in Iran is a water crisis, and a water crisis in 41 degrees Celsius summer heat in a country of 93 million people, with hospitals already under strain, with medical supply chains disrupted by sanctions and the conflict, is a cascade that moves quickly from inconvenience to emergency to something far worse. The Al Jazeera ground team that toured Tehran in July provided a street-level picture that no official statement fully captures. The visual details from that reporting tell the story of a population adapting in real time to chronic infrastructure failure. The small business owner with a generator on the sidewalk humming to keep the refrigerated display case from turning into a room temperature box of spoiled food, the intersection at a major arterial road where the traffic signals have gone dark and a police officer stands in the sun directing the cars by hand, the digital billboard that used to flash advertising and government messaging now sitting blank and dark against the Tehran skyline. These are not dramatic crisis images. They are not the kind of footage that draws immediate international attention. They are images of normalcy being methodically unwound by the removal of reliable electricity from the infrastructure foundation that everything else depends on. People are buying ice to keep medications refrigerated. Families are sleeping on rooftops to escape the 41-degree heat that the apartments below, without fans or air conditioning, have become unbearable in. Businesses that depend on refrigeration, on electronic payment systems, on lighting, the daily commerce of a modern city, are operating on abbreviated schedules that track the blackout windows rather than normal business hours. The economic damage from those interruptions compounds daily in ways that will take years to fully quantify. Inside hospitals, the picture is less normalized and considerably more alarming. Dialysis machines run on electricity. A patient on dialysis who misses a session because the machine has no power does not simply feel unwell. Without regular dialysis, kidney failure patients accumulate toxins in their bloodstream that become life-threatening within days. Ventilators run on electricity. A patient on ventilator support who experiences an unexpected power failure has seconds, not minutes, before the consequences become irreversible. Surgical suites run on electricity. The monitoring equipment that tracks ICU patients runs on electricity. Every hospital in Iran has backup generator capacity, but generators run on diesel fuel, and diesel fuel has a finite supply that requires regular resupply through logistics chains that are themselves disrupted by sanctions, blockade, and the general wartime degradation of commercial supply chains. Iran's ability to import replacement parts for damaged electrical infrastructure and to source diesel fuel for hospital generators has been severely constrained by the same sanctions and supply chain disruptions that contributed to the grid's pre-war structural weakness. When generator fuel runs low, hospital power systems do not gradually dim, they fail. The Germany Office of Technology Assessment's formal study on extended blackouts found that sustained grid collapse leads to societal breakdown within approximately 2 weeks. Water systems irreparably contaminated, communications degraded, backup fuel exhausted, and patients, dependent on powered medical equipment, beginning to die. That study was conducted as a theoretical assessment of a hypothetical scenario in a developed European context. In Iran in July 2026, it is increasingly a real-time operational description of what is unfolding in provincial hospitals that do not have Tehran's relative concentration of resources and backup capacity. President Trump's 48-hour deadline adds a dimension to this story that transforms the electricity crisis from a military campaign side effect into a stated policy instrument. Trump set a deadline, roughly 7:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on a Monday, and warning that the United States would strike Iran's power plants unless Tehran fully reopened the Strait of Hormuz within that window. The specific phrasing matters enormously. He did not say IRGC military sites adjacent to power plants. He said power plants. That is a materially different statement, and it converts Iran's electricity infrastructure from a target class being struck incidentally because IRGC military assets happen to be co-located with or adjacent to power facilities into an explicitly threatened primary target set that will be struck deliberately and comprehensively if Iran does not comply with American demands. Incidental power infrastructure damage that results from strikes on legitimate military targets is one legal and strategic category. Explicitly threatened deliberate destruction of civilian power generation infrastructure as a coercive instrument, linking specific civilian infrastructure destruction directly to a military compliance demand, is a different category with different legal implications and different precedent-setting consequences for how infrastructure warfare is understood and practiced internationally. Iran responded to the deadline threat by threatening to retaliate against Gulf energy and water infrastructure if American forces struck its electricity grid, specifically naming Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG facility, Kuwait's desalination plants, and UAE power generation facilities as potential retaliation targets. Qatar's Ras Laffan is not a peripheral energy facility. It is the single largest LNG export terminal in the world, supplying gas to Europe, Japan, South Korea, and multiple other markets that depend on that supply for industrial production and residential heating. A successful Iranian strike on Ras Laffan would send energy prices across multiple continents sharply higher within hours. Oil markets registered the threat immediately, Prices rose to $117 per barrel as traders priced in the risk of a broader infrastructure exchange that could disrupt supply from the region that holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. The interdependency loop that Iran was threatening to exploit is real, and the Gulf states that have been supporting the American campaign diplomatically and logistically are not immune to the retaliatory reach of the IRGC's remaining ballistic missile and drone capabilities. Kuwait already confirmed severe damage to its own infrastructure from Iranian retaliatory strikes and advised its civilian population to ration power. The infrastructure warfare bidirectional dynamic is already active, and the Trump deadline was the moment it went from implicit risk to explicit stated policy on both sides simultaneously. Now, here is the honesty check, because this story has genuine complexity that requires acknowledging both sides of the causation question with analytical precision rather than political convenience. The energy minister's statement that the country is in an exceptional situation is accurate, and it is also true that the exceptional situation predates American strikes by years, not months, years. Electricity allocations for some Iranian industries were already cut from 8 megawatts to 2 megawatts by May 13, 2026, before the major escalation rounds of July that produced the headlines about the grid going dark. Electricity was already being sold on Iran's energy exchange at 4 times the standard rate before the worst of the summer strikes. Cryptocurrency mining operations, many running illicit rigs drawing enormous quantities of subsidized power from a grid that could not afford to spare it, were cited by the energy minister himself as a contributing factor to peak demand strain that predated any American targeting decision. The grid's structural deficit of 13,600 megawatts during peak demand was documented by Iranian parliamentary researchers before the first American bomb fell. Heavy rains in spring 2026 actually boosted hydroelectric output and partially compensated for other generation losses, meaning without that unexpected natural contribution, the summer crisis would have arrived earlier and in worse condition. Iranian energy expert Arman's quote to Al Jazeera, "The war was merely the straw that broke the camel's back," is analytically accurate. The 4,200 megawatts knocked offline by strikes landed on top of a 13,600 megawatt pre-existing deficit. The war accelerated and amplified a crisis that was already structurally inevitable given the state of Iran's energy infrastructure before February 2026. That dual causation does not absolve the strikes of their contribution to civilian harm. But it does mean that any analysis of the grid crisis that attributes it entirely to American military action is incomplete, and that any eventual reconstruction of Iran's electricity infrastructure will require addressing the decades of underinvestment, mismanagement, and subsidy distortion that the war exposed rather than created. You have made it to the global roundup section, and the regional infrastructure damage picture extends beyond Iran's borders in ways that are reshaping the civilian risk calculus across the entire Gulf. Kuwait reported severe damage to its own infrastructure after Iranian retaliatory strikes and advised its civilian population to ration electricity consumption. A country that had been providing diplomatic and logistical support to the American campaign found itself managing its own infrastructure crisis because Iranian missiles had successfully degraded Kuwaiti power facilities. One Kuwaiti civilian was killed in Iranian retaliatory fire. That is a concrete demonstration that infrastructure warfare in this conflict is genuinely bidirectional. Iran is absorbing the larger and more comprehensive damage by orders of magnitude. But the IRGC's retaliatory reach has produced real civilian infrastructure harm in neighboring countries that are not parties to this conflict in any military sense. Jordan has reported Iranian missiles landing on its territory. Bahrain has had air defense sirens activating as Iranian drones and missiles transit its airspace toward American facilities on the island. Iraq has reported explosions in the northern city of Sulaymaniyah from IRGC-linked missile activity. The geographic spread of active military action across this region is a fact that the daily strike updates can obscure. When you focus on Iranian casualties and Iranian grid failures, it is easy to miss that Kuwait has a dead civilian, that Jordan has missile craters in its territory, and that Bahrain is running its air defense systems against incoming threats multiple times per week. Oil prices reaching $117 per barrel reflect the market's aggregate assessment that supply disruption risk across this region has reached a level that justifies a substantial premium above the conflict-free baseline price. The Iran threat to strike Qatar's Ras Laffan LNG facility is not a peripheral escalation threat. Ras Laffan is the facility through which Qatar exports the natural gas that heats European homes and powers Japanese and South Korean industry. The energy and infrastructure interdependency of this region means that the civilian consequences of this conflict have already crossed national borders and are affecting populations across the globe through energy price inflation and supply chain disruption, even before any escalation of the infrastructure warfare dimension reaches the catastrophic threshold that analysts warned about when this conflict began. You have made it to the strategic analysis section, And here is the board that reveals what Iran's power grid going dark means beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis. The first piece of this board is the infrastructure warfare precedent and what it means for the international legal and moral framework that the United States has spent decades building and enforcing. When Russia struck Ukraine's power grid during the winter of 2022, the United States government condemned those strikes publicly, explicitly, and in sustained terms, characterizing them as deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure that violated the laws of armed conflict and were designed to maximize civilian suffering as a form of coercion. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for 2 Russian commanders in March 2024, specifically charging them with directing missile strikes against Ukraine's electric grid that caused harm to civilians disproportionate to any military advantage gained. The Korea Times, reporting on Iran's power crisis, made the comparison directly. When the bombs were Russian, the law was clear, and the law did not change when they became American. The legal and moral framework that condemned Russian power grid strikes in Ukraine in 2022 does not contain a nationality exemption for American military forces. The infrastructure is the same category of target. The civilian consequences, power loss, water loss, medical equipment failure, food spoilage, are the same cascade of harm. And the population bearing those consequences in Iran, the family sweating in the 41-degree apartment, the dialysis patient whose machine is running on generator fuel that runs out, the 20 villages with no water after the desalination plant was struck, that population did not choose the military policy that triggered the strikes any more than Ukrainian civilians chose Vladimir Putin's foreign policy. The honest strategic analysis of the American infrastructure campaign in Iran has to include this dimension, not as a reason to stop protecting freedom of navigation or to allow Iran to maintain a nuclear weapons program, but because the precedents being set in this conflict will be cited by other parties in future conflicts. And the credibility of the international norms that the United States helped write depends on the consistency with which it applies them to its own actions, as well as to its adversaries. The second piece of this board is what the regime's decision to absorb this infrastructure damage, rather than negotiate, reveals about its actual political calculus. The IRGC is not making decisions based on the welfare of Iran's civilian population. The executions of protesters that continued even while American bombs were falling on IRGC military sites make that unmistakably clear. And the continuation of attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, even after the power grid began failing, makes it clearer still. An organization that genuinely prioritized civilian welfare would have stopped the behavior that was triggering the strikes long before the power grid reached crisis. The IRGC did not stop. The decision to continue firing at tankers in the Strait of Hormuz after the power grid was already showing the strain of early strikes, a decision that accelerated the escalation that produced the current grid crisis, reflects leadership that has concluded that regime survival requires maintaining control of the Strait of Hormuz at any cost to Iranian civilians. Because the IRGC's economic power, the foundation of its domestic political control, flows from the toll it collects on Hormuz transit, losing that economic power means losing the patronage networks that buy the loyalty of the constituencies that keep the IRGC in power. The civilian population paying the price of grid failure is, from the IRGC's perspective, a cost to be managed rather than a constraint on policy. And that calculus, regime survival over civilian welfare, is consistent with everything the IRGC has done throughout this conflict and throughout its history of suppressing Iranian dissent. The third piece of this board is what 4,200 megawatts of confirmed grid damage, combined with 25% gas production reduction, combined with 12-hour industrial blackouts, combined with water disruption to 10,000 people from one desalination strike, combined with electricity selling at 4 times the standard rate, combined with industry allocations cut from 8 megawatts to 2 megawatts. What all of that together means for the Iranian regime's domestic political sustainability. Authoritarian regimes maintain control through 2 instruments: the ability to threaten violence and the ability to provide economic sufficiency. The military pressure of this campaign has been degrading the threat of violence instrument by destroying IRGC military capability. The economic pressure of the blockade and sanctions has been attacking the revenue streams that fund the patronage networks that buy loyalty. And now the infrastructure campaign has begun attacking the basic economic sufficiency of the civilian population in a way that is direct, daily, personal, and impossible for people to ignore or rationalize away with state media narratives. When the lights go out in Tehran for 6 hours in 41-degree heat, and there is no warning and no reliable restoration timeline, the IRGC cannot tell the population that America is losing. When the water stops flowing because the electric pumps have no power and the queue for water delivery trucks stretches around a city block, the Iranian civilians' direct daily physical experience of this conflict becomes incompatible with the state media narrative of IRGC invincibility and American weakness. When electricity sells at 4 times the standard rate, and industries that employed Iranians are running at 25% of previous allocation because there's not enough power to run them fully, the economic cost of IRGC military adventurism in the Strait of Hormuz is being translated into direct personal economic loss for every family in the country. The grid going dark is not just a humanitarian crisis, and it is not just a strategic military achievement. It is a daily political crisis for a regime whose domestic authority depends on the appearance of control and competence, and a regime that is visibly failing to keep the lights on, failing to keep the water flowing, failing to keep the hospitals adequately powered, failing to prevent factories from going dark for 12 hours at a time. That regime is a regime whose population has direct, unmediated daily evidence that the state cannot deliver the most basic function of modern governance, which is reliable infrastructure. That evidence accumulates, and it does not unaccumulate when a government official gives a press conference. The 4,200 megawatts that Mohammed Al-Haddad confirmed are not just megawatts. They are the daily experience of 93 million Iranians whose relationship with the regime that governs them is being reshaped by every hour the power stays off. What do you think? Does the confirmed 4,200 megawatt generation loss and damage to more than 2,000 points across Iran's electricity system represent the threshold at which the civilian population's daily experience of this conflict becomes incompatible with IRGC domestic political control? Does the electricity crisis, which is simultaneously a water crisis, a food spoilage crisis, a medical equipment crisis, and an economic crisis, represent the kind of civilian pressure that eventually forces the Iranian regime toward a genuine negotiated outcome rather than continued tactical ceasefire requests designed to buy reconstitution time? And what is the right analytical framework for evaluating infrastructure strikes that cause civilian harm when the military assets being protected by that infrastructure belong to a regime that is simultaneously executing its own protesters, and when the grid was structurally failing before the first bomb fell? These are not simple questions, and anyone claiming a simple answer is not being honest about the complexity. The 4,200 megawatts that Mohammed Al-Haddad confirmed are at the center of the most important moral, legal, strategic, and humanitarian questions this conflict raises. Drop your analysis in the comments right now, because this is exactly the kind of question where the thinking in this community goes deeper and more honestly than what you find in most mainstream coverage. And those conversations shape the public understanding of what is actually happening and what it means. If this breakdown gave you the clearest and most complete picture of what Iran's power grid going dark actually means, the confirmed numbers, the water electricity cascade, the medical dimension, the dual causation, the political sustainability question, hit that like button right now and get this analysis in front of more people who deserve the full picture rather than the simplified version. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the infrastructure crisis inside Iran is developing every day, and every significant, verifiable update gets a full breakdown the moment it becomes clear. Share this with someone who is following this conflict and needs to understand the civilian dimension as clearly as the military dimension, because the two are inseparable and both matter. Stay sharp, stay locked in, and we will see you in the next one.